"I want a cappuccino, no coffee." For a second the room went quiet. Not silent, just paused. The way a place does when something doesn't make sense, but no one wants to question it yet. Lena looked at the man sitting at the bar. He was already drunk enough to smile at his own joke, already confident that someone would correct him, or laugh, or hesitate. She didn't. She nodded once and turned away. A minute later, she placed a cup in front of him. Warm milk, thick foam. No espresso. The man laughed, pleased with himself. Then he leaned in closer than he should have. Lena adjusted her stance, subtle but deliberate, placing the counter between them. She said nothing. She didn't need to. That was when someone else stepped forward. The man behind the bar didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply took the cup, poured the milk onto the counter, and looked the customer in the eye. "Leave." No one clapped. No one reacted. The man stood up, embarrassed and suddenly sober, and walked out. The music continued. Glasses clinked. Life moved on. Lena wiped the counter clean and returned to her work, unaware that this small, absurd moment, a cappuccino without coffee, was the first time her life stopped being decided for her, and she had no idea what was about to follow. Lena learned early that some people were meant to speak and others were meant to listen. In her family, she belonged to the second group. After her mother died, the house changed in quiet ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. Her father became distant, retreating into long silences and routines that left little room for conversation. He still lived under the same roof, still paid the bills, still sat at the dinner table, but his presence felt more like an obligation than a choice. The woman he married later filled the space he left behind. Lena's stepmother was not cruel in obvious ways. She did not shout or strike. Instead, she decided things. What Lena wore, when she should be home, which opinions were acceptable and which were unnecessary. Over time, Lena learned that resistance only led to longer lectures, colder stares, and a sense of guilt she could never quite shake. So she stopped resisting. Silence became her way of surviving. Agreement became her shield. Lena learned to nod, to lower her eyes, to let decisions pass over her as if they had nothing to do with her life at all. By the time she reached adulthood, the pattern felt natural. When the conversation about marriage began, it did not feel sudden. It felt inevitable. Mark's name was introduced at the dinner table, spoken carefully, as if it carried weight on its own. He was described as practical, stable, someone who could take care of things. No one asked Lena what she felt. No one waited for her reaction. The arrangement was presented as a solution, not a question. Lena listened. She told herself that marriage was supposed to be about compromise, that love was something people built over time, not something that appeared all at once. She had seen enough disappointment to know that expectations were dangerous. Stability, at least, sounded safe. When she said yes, no one looked surprised. The wedding was small and efficient. There were no long speeches, no emotional moments that lingered in memory. Guests came, smiled, ate and left. The ceremony moved quickly, like a task everyone wanted to complete and move past. Standing beside Mark, Lena felt strangely detached. She was not unhappy, but she was not joyful either. It felt like stepping into a role that had been written long before she arrived on stage. She noticed details instead. The texture of the dress against her skin, the stiffness of Mark's hand in hers, the way the room seemed colder than it should have been. These were small things, but they stayed with her. That night, when the door closed behind them, Lena waited for something to change, for a feeling to settle in her chest, for certainty or excitement or even fear. Nothing came. At first, Mark did not seem dangerous. He was quiet, reserved, and carried himself with a confidence that did not demand attention. He spoke little about himself, but enough to suggest ambition, enough to sound like someone who knew where he was going. Lena told herself that was a good thing. She adjusted to married life the way she adjusted to everything else, carefully, without complaint. She learned Mark's habits, his moods, his silences. She paid attention, not because she was curious, but because attention had always been her way of staying safe. In the early days, she believed she had made a reasonable choice. There was no passion, but there was structure. No warmth, but no immediate chaos either. For someone who had grown up in a house ruled by unspoken expectations, predictability felt comforting. She did not expect happiness. She expected balance. Sometimes, late at night, she allowed herself a quieter hope. That familiarity might grow into affection. That shared routines could turn into something gentler. That love might arrive slowly, unnoticed at first, the way dawn crept into the sky before anyone realized the night was gone. She held on to that thought longer than she should have, because Lena did not marry for romance. She married because it seemed like the next logical step in a life that had never truly belonged to her. Marriage, she believed, would finally give her a place that was hers, a role she could fulfill without question, a future that made sense to the people around her. What she did not know, what she could not yet see, was that stability, when chosen for the wrong reasons, could become another kind of cage. But on that first night, standing in a quiet apartment that smelled unfamiliar, Lena told herself that this was how beginnings were supposed to feel: uncertain, neutral, manageable. She did not realize she had already learned how to disappear. For a while, Lena believed she had been wrong to worry. The early months of marriage passed without disaster. There were no dramatic arguments, no sudden explosions that forced her to confront regret. Mark settled into their shared life with an efficiency that made everything seem manageable. When things went well, he was attentive in quiet, unexpected ways. Some nights, when Lena came home late from work, she found dinner already prepared. The food was simple, nothing elaborate, but it was warm. Mark would be sitting at the small kitchen table, scrolling through his phone or watching the clock as if he had been waiting. He rarely said much, but sometimes he smiled and asked if she was tired. On those evenings, Lena told herself that this was what stability looked like. Mark talked about the future in vague but confident terms. He spoke of better apartments, of opportunities that would come once things lined up properly. He did not promise timelines, but he spoke as if progress were inevitable. Listening to him, Lena felt something close to relief. Maybe this was enough. She adjusted herself to his rhythm the way she always did. She learned which days he was quieter than usual, which moods meant he wanted company, and which meant he preferred silence. She did not ask many questions. Experience had taught her that questions complicated things. At first, the signs were easy to ignore: a missed dinner here, a restless night there. Occasional absences that Mark explained away with vague excuses about friends or errands that had taken longer than expected. Lena accepted these explanations without protest. Trust, she believed, was something you chose to practice. Then the absences became patterns. Mark started coming home later, his movements looser, his voice slightly unsteady. The smell of alcohol clung to his clothes, faint at first, then impossible to miss. He laughed more loudly on those nights, spoke faster, as if trying to outrun something invisible. When Lena asked, carefully, if everything was all right, Mark brushed it off. Everyone drank. Everyone needed an outlet. She was worrying too much, so she stopped asking. The first time Lena realized Mark was gambling, it was not through confession. It was through omission. Bills that should have been paid were suddenly overdue. Money she had set aside seemed to disappear faster than expected. When she brought it up, Mark grew defensive, his tone sharp in a way she had not heard before. It was the tone that unsettled her most, because it was different. When Mark was winning, at cards, at the tables, at whatever quiet games he played beyond her view, he was almost gentle. He touched her shoulder when passing by. He joked lightly, as if the world were cooperating with him again. On those nights, he spoke of her as if she were his anchor, the one thing keeping everything steady. Lena clung to that version of him, but when Mark lost, the shift was immediate. His patience disappeared. His voice hardened. The space between words filled with tension that made Lena instinctively retreat. He paced the apartment, muttering under his breath, blaming circumstances, luck, other people. The air itself seemed to tighten. He never apologized. Instead, he asked for money. At first, it was framed as temporary, just until things turned around, just until the next opportunity. Lena told herself that helping him was part of being a wife, that partnerships required sacrifice. She transferred money quietly, careful not to make it feel like charity. Then the requests became demands. Mark stopped asking if she could help. He told her she needed to. When she hesitated, his frustration spilled over in smaller, more cutting ways, sharp words, slammed doors. A silence that lasted for days, heavy with accusation. Lena began working longer hours. She took on extra shifts without complaint. She learned how to stretch her income, how to make small sacrifices disappear. She told herself that this was temporary, that endurance was a form of strength. At night, when she lay awake beside Mark, listening to his uneven breathing, she replayed the good moments in her mind. The dinners, the smiles, the way he sometimes spoke of her as if she mattered. Those memories became her evidence, because the alternative, that the kind version of Mark was an illusion, felt too dangerous to consider. The two versions of him existed side by side, and Lena learned to navigate between them. She adjusted her behavior to avoid the wrong one. She watched for signs, listened for changes in his voice, memorized the patterns that kept the peace. Over time, something shifted inside her. She began to doubt herself. When Mark was kind, she wondered if she had imagined the tension. When he was cruel, she wondered if she had provoked it. The contrast was disorienting, like standing in two different rooms, without realizing the door between them had closed. Lena stopped trusting her own instincts. Instead, she trusted effort. If she worked harder, things would stabilize. If she stayed calm, Mark would soften. If she believed long enough, the version of him she loved would stay. This belief did not come from optimism. It came from necessity, because admitting failure would mean admitting that she had walked willingly into another life she could not control. So Lena endured. She told herself that marriage was not supposed to be easy, that love, when it came, required patience, that the good days mattered more than the bad. And on the nights when Mark cooked dinner and waited for her to come home, when his voice was warm and his hands steady, Lena allowed herself to hope. She did not yet understand that the space between those nights was growing, and that hope, once attached to the wrong person, could be the most exhausting thing of all. The night it ended did not begin differently from the others. Lena came home late, her body heavy with exhaustion she could no longer name. The apartment lights were off, but the air felt wrong the moment she stepped inside. It was the kind of wrongness she had learned to recognize, the kind that settled in her chest before her mind could catch up. Mark arrived some time after midnight. She heard him before she saw him. The unsteady rhythm of his steps, the careless way the door closed behind him. The smell of alcohol reached her even from across the room, sharp and unmistakable. Lena did not ask how his night had gone. She already knew. Mark moved through the apartment like a storm that had nowhere to go. He paced, muttered, laughed once in a way that did not reach his eyes. His frustration filled the space between them, thick and oppressive. This time, he had lost badly. Lena could tell by the way his voice trembled, not with sadness, but with anger he could not contain. He blamed the game, the people, the timing. He blamed everything except himself. When he turned to her, his eyes were unfocused, but his attention was sharp. He asked for money, not gently, not carefully. There was no pretense left. Lena stood still, her hands at her sides. She felt something inside her hesitate, then go quiet. The familiar calculations ran through her mind. How much she had left, what bills were due, what she could afford to give without losing everything. But beneath those thoughts, something else surfaced. Tiredness. Not the kind that sleep could fix. Not the kind that came from long hours or missed meals. This was deeper, heavier. A weariness that pressed down on her bones and made even breathing feel like effort. She realized she did not have the strength to explain anymore. Mark's frustration escalated when she did not respond quickly enough. His words grew sharper, his movements more erratic. He crossed lines she had carefully redrawn so many times before. The space she had tried to protect for herself vanished, and in that moment, Lena felt it. Not fear, emptiness. The fear that had kept her careful, compliant and alert for so long simply wasn't there anymore. It had burned itself out. Whatever power it once held over her had dissolved into something hollow and distant. Lena did not cry. She did not shout. She did not plead. She watched Mark, really watched him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. There was no version of him waiting on the other side of this night, no gentler future hidden beneath the chaos, no reward for endurance. That realization landed quietly, and once it settled, there was nothing left to fight. When Lena finally moved, it was not dramatic. She went to the bedroom and closed the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting loosely in her lap, and waited for the noise outside to fade into silence. By morning, the decision had already been made. The days that followed blurred together. Mark oscillated between irritation and indifference, as if unsure whether to be angry or dismissive. Lena went through the motions with a calm that surprised even her. She contacted a lawyer. She gathered documents. She packed only what was necessary. There were no confrontations worth remembering. The divorce process unfolded quietly, stripped of emotion and spectacle. Mark did not fight it. He did not apologize either. He seemed more inconvenienced than wounded, more annoyed by the disruption than affected by its meaning. Lena signed the papers with steady hands. There was no sense of victory, no relief grand enough to celebrate, only a muted stillness that followed her everywhere. like the echo of a sound that had already faded. When she left the apartment for the last time, she carried very little with her. A bag of clothes, personal items that fit easily into boxes. Everything else, the furniture, the shared purchases, the life they had assembled, stayed behind. It felt appropriate, because none of it had ever truly belonged to her. That first night alone, Lena sat in the quiet of a borrowed space and listened to the unfamiliar sound of nothing happening. No raised voices, no tension vibrating through the walls, no footsteps she needed to track. The silence was unsettling. She did not know what to do with it yet. Grief did not arrive the way she expected. There was no wave of sadness, no overwhelming sense of loss. Instead, there was a hollow space where something had once been, accompanied by a strange, fragile sense of lightness, as if a weight she had carried for so long she no longer recognized had finally been set down. Lena understood then that leaving was not an act of courage. It was an act of survival. She had not left because she was angry. She had left because there was nothing left to give. No more hope to spend. No more excuses to make. Fear had kept her inside the marriage for a long time. But fear, she learned, could only hold someone for so long before exhaustion took over. And exhaustion, unlike fear, did not argue. It simply ended things. By the time the divorce was finalized, Lena felt neither whole nor broken. She felt empty in a way that allowed room for something else, though she did not yet know what that something might be. She stepped forward without a plan, without certainty, without the illusion that life would suddenly become easier. All she knew was this: the night everything broke was also the night she stopped disappearing. After the divorce was finalized, Lena did what she had always done when life collapsed. She went back to her father's house. It was not a decision born of hope, but of necessity. She had nowhere else to go. The apartment she left behind was no longer hers, and the quiet freedom she had gained came without shelter. Returning felt temporary, like standing under a roof during a storm and telling herself she would leave once the rain stopped. The house looked the same as it always had. The walls were unchanged. The furniture sat in familiar places. Even the air smelled the same, clean, orderly, controlled. Yet something about it felt smaller now, tighter, as if the space had learned how to close in on itself. Her father did not ask many questions. He listened when she explained, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable. He did not say he was glad she was home. He did not say he was proud of her for leaving. He simply told her she could stay for a while. For a while. The words settled heavily in Lena's chest. Her stepmother filled the silence he left behind. She noticed everything. How long Lena slept. How much space her belongings took up. How often she was in the kitchen. The comments were never raised voices, never outright accusations. They were framed as concern, as practicality, as reminders of how things worked in this house. Lena learned quickly that her presence disrupted a balance she was not meant to touch. She was reminded, subtly, repeatedly, that she was no longer a child, that she should have planned better, that divorce complicated things. The tone was polite, but the message was clear. Her return was inconvenient. Lena kept her head down. She cleaned without being asked. She avoided shared spaces when she could. She adjusted herself to the household's rhythms, just as she always had. But something inside her resisted the old habits now. She had already left one place that did not want her. She did not intend to disappear again. The control came in small ways, Questions about where she was going, suggestions about what she should wear, comments about how long she stayed out. None of it was framed as permission or restriction, only as expectation. Lena recognized the pattern immediately. This house had rules, and none of them were hers. At night, lying in the room she had grown up in, Lena stared at the ceiling and listened to the familiar sounds of a life that moved forward without her. She felt the same quiet erasure she had felt years ago, only sharper now, because this time she knew what it cost. The realization came gradually, but with certainty. She could not stay, not because she was being thrown out, not because there was an argument to point to, but because remaining meant surrendering again, to dependence, to control, to the slow shrinking of herself. Lena began looking for work almost immediately. She did not tell her family at first. She searched quietly, applying wherever she could. The process was humbling. Rejections arrived without explanation. Silence followed many of her applications. But she persisted, driven by a sense of urgency she could not ignore. Work meant independence. Independence meant distance. When she finally found a position, it was not glamorous. The hours were long, the environment demanding, but it offered something she needed more than comfort: a paycheck. The first time she handed over part of her earnings to contribute to the household, her stepmother accepted it without comment. The absence of gratitude stung more than outright criticism. It confirmed what Lena already knew. This place was not a refuge. It was a stopover. As the days passed, Lena spent more time outside the house. She left early. She came back late. She kept her plans to herself. The more she worked, the less space she occupied. The tension eased slightly, not because she was more welcome, but because she was less present. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Lena stood in the doorway of the house and realized she no longer felt relief upon entering. There was no sense of return, no grounding warmth, just a quiet awareness that this was not where she belonged. It was then that the second truth settled in. For the second time in her life, Lena had nowhere to go. The first time, she had chosen marriage as an escape. She had believed stability could be borrowed from someone else's certainty. That mistake had cost her years of herself. This time, she did not look for rescue. She looked for exit. Lena began saving quietly, carefully. She reduced her needs to the bare minimum. Each small step felt like reclaiming something she had once given away. The house did not change. Her father remained distant. Her stepmother remained vigilant. But Lena's relationship to the space shifted. She was no longer trying to belong. She was preparing to leave. On her nights off, she sat alone and planned. Not grand dreams or distant futures, but practical steps. A place of her own, a schedule she controlled, a life that did not require permission. The thought did not fill her with excitement. It filled her with resolve. Leaving Mark had been an ending born of exhaustion. Leaving her family, she realized, would be an ending born of clarity. Some homes did not throw you out. They simply reminded you day by day that you were never meant to stay. And this time, Lena listened. Lena found the lounge the way she found most things in her life, through need, not desire. After her father's house made it clear she was only allowed to exist there as quietly as possible, Lena stopped thinking in terms of comfort. She thought in terms of numbers, how much she could earn, how quickly she could save, how soon she could leave. The lounge was hiring, the schedule was heavy, the pay wasn't glamorous, but it was real. There were tips, There were hours. There was a chance to stack money faster than she could in the kind of daytime work that expected you to smile while being ignored. On her first day, she arrived early, hair pulled back, hands steady, stomach tight. The place looked nothing like the clean, silent house she had returned to. The lounge was dim and polished, designed to make the outside world feel far away. Soft lighting, dark wood, the faint hum of music that never fully demanded attention. It smelled like citrus, alcohol, and something expensive she couldn't name. The manager, a man who moved fast and spoke as if time was always short, walked her through the basics. Where to stand, what not to say, which customers were regulars, which tables were easy, and which ones weren't. He told her the most important rule in a voice that sounded casual but wasn't. The lounge protected its people, but only if they stayed professional. Lena nodded the way she always did. She didn't ask questions. She watched. That was her strength, even when she didn't call it that. She noticed how the servers moved around certain customers, how the bartenders shifted their posture when particular men entered. She noted the camera placement, the exits, the line of sight between the bar and the far corner tables. She listened to the way the staff spoke about the owner, Roman Cole. They didn't say his name with admiration, exactly. They said it with caution, with the kind of respect that didn't come from friendliness. Roman didn't run the place like a smiling businessman. He owned it the way a storm owned the sky. Lena didn't see him that first day. She worked her shift, learned the menu, carried trays until her shoulders ached. She kept her smile small and neutral. She dealt with the usual things that came with a job like this. Men who leaned too close, women who looked her up and down and decided she was competition, couples who treated her like part of the furniture. She didn't take it personally. She couldn't afford to. By the end of the week, Lena understood the rhythm of the lounge, the early evening rush, the midnight peak, the late-night slow burn when the tips got better and the customers got worse. She learned which drinks were requested by name and which ones were ordered as a performance. That was how she began to recognize Roman's pattern. He wasn't there every night, but when he came in, the room changed. Not dramatically, not with announcements or attention. It was quieter than that. The staff straightened. The manager became more focused. Even the customers, the ones who thought they owned every space they walked into, seemed to instinctively lower their volume. Roman never had to ask for control. It arrived before he did. Lena saw him from a distance first. He didn't dress like a man trying to impress anyone. He wore simple, expensive clothing that looked effortless. Nothing flashy, no loud jewellery, no theatrical confidence. But he carried himself with a stillness that made him impossible to ignore. He didn't scan the room like someone looking for approval. He looked like someone checking facts. He spoke quietly to the manager. He barely nodded at anyone else. Then he moved toward the back as if the lounge belonged to him in a way that went beyond paperwork. It did. Lena's first memorable interaction with Roman did not start with him. It started with a customer. The man arrived late, already intoxicated, smiling too wide. He slid onto a bar stool like he had been born there. His words came out slightly slurred, but his eyes were sharp in the way drunk men often were, aware enough to misbehave, impaired enough to pretend it wasn't their fault. When Lena approached, he looked at her like she was part of the entertainment. He didn't ask what she recommended. He didn't glance at the menu. He leaned forward, voice loud enough for nearby patrons to hear, and said, "I want a cappuccino." Lena waited. He tilted his head, amused with himself, and added, "No coffee." For a second the request hung in the air, absurd and deliberate. A test, a performance, an invitation for her to correct him so he could laugh at her reaction. Lena did not correct him. She didn't smile too much either. She kept her expression neutral, her voice calm. She repeated the order in her mind, the way she had learned to repeat everything she couldn't change. Warm milk, thick foam, no espresso. She went behind the bar, asked the bartender for steamed, milk with foam, and returned a minute later with a cup that looked exactly like a cappuccino, until the first sip revealed it wasn't. The customer stared at it, then laughed. "Oh, you're smart," he said, like he was awarding her something. "You actually did it." Lena placed the cup down carefully, not too close to his hands. He took a sip and made a sound that was half approval, half mockery. Then he leaned in, closer than he needed to, and said something low that made Lena's skin tighten. His grin suggested he thought the night belonged to him, that her job included tolerating whatever mood he brought with him. Lena didn't step back dramatically. She didn't make a scene. She simply shifted her posture. One small step that changed the angle between them, placed the bar and the counter's edge as a barrier. Her face stayed calm, her voice steady. Her hand stayed near the tray as if that alone could remind him she was working, not flirting. The man didn't take the hint. He reached out, fingers careless, aiming for her wrist as if touching her was part of the joke. Lena felt her body prepare for something it had learned too well. A familiar freeze. A flicker of fear that used to arrive fast. But before she could decide how to respond, another presence cut through the space beside her. Roman. He stepped to the bar as if he had been there all along. He didn't announce himself. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at Lena first. He looked at the customer. The man's grin hesitated, uncertain for the first time. Roman's hand moved with controlled simplicity. He took the cup of milk, still steaming, still innocent in appearance, and poured it onto the bar top in one smooth motion. The white liquid spread across the polished surface, dripping like a slow erasure of the customer's entitlement. The room did not gasp. It didn't need to. The message was loud, without sound. Roman leaned slightly toward the man, his voice quiet, enough that only those closest could hear. Lena caught only fragments. She didn't need the words. The customer's face changed. His smile flattened. He tried to laugh, tried to recover his performance, but it didn't land. Not here, not under Roman's eyes. Roman held his gaze, unmoved. Then, still calm, Roman pointed toward the door. The customer hesitated once, just long enough to decide whether he could challenge this, and then stood. His stool scraped the floor. His steps were less confident than when he arrived. He muttered something under his breath that sounded like an excuse. No one stopped him. The door closed behind him, and the lounge returned to its rhythm as if nothing had happened. The music didn't shift. The lights didn't change. The world simply continued. Lena stood still for a moment, hand steady, heartbeat loud in her own ears. Roman glanced at the spilled milk and then at the bartender. "Clean it," he said, not harshly, simply as a fact. And then his eyes met Lena's. It wasn't a look of pity. It wasn't reassurance. It was something more difficult to interpret. Acknowledgement, not of her vulnerability, of her professionalism. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't say anything that would make her feel like she owed him gratitude. He turned away and walked toward the back, leaving Lena with a strange sensation, she hadn't felt in a long time. Safety, not the soft kind, the kind enforced by rules. That night, Lena went home with tips in her pocket and a new understanding of where she worked. This place had boundaries, and someone here made sure they mattered. Over the next few shifts, Lena tried not to think about Roman. She focused on money, on survival, on saving enough to leave her father's house. But she couldn't help noticing patterns, because noticing was what she did. Roman did not hover. He did not seek her out. He didn't treat her differently in ways that would make people talk. If he noticed her at all, he kept it quiet. And yet, Lena found herself more aware when he was in the building. Not because she wanted to be, because her body had learned to track power in a room. A few nights later, another customer, also drunk, though more amused than aggressive, flagged Lena down with a dramatic wave of his hand. "Why is the restroom so far?" he complained loudly, as if it were a personal betrayal. "You expect people to walk a mile in here?" It wasn't the question itself that mattered. It was the tone, the expectation that Lena would apologize for the building's layout as if she personally designed it. Lena didn't apologize. She didn't argue either. She looked at him with calm politeness, a faint hint of humor, and said, "It hasn't moved, I promise." A pause, just enough. "But I can walk you there before it feels any farther." The man blinked, then laughed. Real laughter this time, the kind that released tension instead of creating it. Nearby customers smiled. The moment softened. Lena didn't linger. She simply gestured toward the hallway and guided him with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. When she returned, she saw Roman standing near the far end of the bar, half in shadow, watching the room the way he always did. His expression didn't change much, but his attention remained where it had been a second longer than necessary. Lena pretended not to notice. She finished her shift. She went home. Life continued, but somewhere inside, a small part of her registered something important. She had handled it on her own, without shrinking, without losing herself. A few days later, Roman returned after being away. The staff mentioned he'd been out of town, business-related, the kind of business no one asked questions about. Lena didn't care where he went. It wasn't her world. Still, she noticed when he walked in. It was a weekday afternoon, just after 4. Lena knew that hour well. It was normally quiet. The lounge caught between lunch crowds and evening traffic. The kind of time when servers wiped already clean tables to look busy. But that afternoon, it wasn't quiet. The room had energy, not chaotic, not packed to the walls, but alive. More people than usual for that hour. Small groups, pairs, individuals who didn't seem to know each other, yet still looked engaged. Lena moved through the space, taking orders, watching the flow. Something had shifted in the room's social current. People were talking to strangers, laughing more easily, staying longer. Roman noticed too. He didn't ask loudly. He didn't interrupt the floor. He called the manager over with a small hand gesture and spoke to him in a low voice. Lena saw the manager point briefly toward the hostess stand, where a small box sat beside a stack of simple cards. Nothing flashy. No announcements. No posters. Roman's gaze followed. After a few minutes, the manager walked away looking, slightly nervous, the way people looked when they had just answered a question they hoped was correct. Later, Lena heard what happened. Not from gossip, but from the quiet way the manager addressed her as he passed. "They're doing that thing you suggested," he said softly, as if sharing a neutral fact. "It's working." Lena didn't smile. She didn't ask for praise. She simply nodded. The idea had been simple. She had noticed that the lounge's slow hours felt empty, not because there were no customers, but because the customers were isolated. People came alone or in pairs, stayed cautious, and left quickly because the room didn't feel alive. So Lena suggested a small experiment, a random table pairing system for guests who arrived alone or in small groups and didn't mind sitting with others. They'd draw a card, just a letter, the first initial of their name, and be seated at the table matching that letter. Nothing romantic, nothing forced, just a gentle disruption of the usual loneliness. It created conversation without pressure. It created atmosphere without marketing. The manager had been skeptical, but tried it anyway, quietly. No promotion, just a soft option at the door. And now the lounge was fuller in the hour it used to be hollow. Lena didn't think of it as brilliance. She thought of it as observation. People wanted connection. They just didn't want to be embarrassed while seeking it. She returned to her work. She didn't tell anyone it had been her idea. She didn't watch for reactions. But Roman was watching the room like a man who understood systems. Before he left, he walked toward the hostess stand. He looked at the small box of cards with the same expression he might have given a lock he intended to test. He didn't ask for help. He didn't call anyone over. He simply reached in and pulled a card at random. Lena was across the room carrying a tray. She saw him glance at the letter, then fold the card and slip it into his coat pocket as if it belonged there. For a second, something almost like amusement touched his face. Not a smile meant for anyone else, something private. Then he walked out, leaving the lounge behind without changing its temperature. Lena didn't know what letter he pulled. She didn't know he had taken it. She didn't know what it meant to him. She only knew what it meant to her. For the first time in a long time, something she had noticed and acted upon had improved the world around her, even in a small way, even in a place that wasn't hers. She went home that night with tired feet and money in her pocket, but also with a quiet sense of proof. She was not only surviving, she was still capable, and somewhere in the city, a man who owned a room full of power and rules carried a small paper card in his pocket, thinking about a woman who did not ask to be noticed. Not because she was fragile, because she was steady. And steadiness, Roman Cole knew, was rare. Lena did not notice the change at first. Not because it wasn't happening, but because she had spent most of her life learning not to expect the world to soften for her. When something became easier, her instinct was to assume it was temporary. A calm before the next demand. A pause before the next problem. Still, the lounge began to feel different. The regulars who used to test boundaries stopped trying with her. Certain customers who had made a habit of lingering too close suddenly found reasons to sit elsewhere. Men who used to speak to her like she was disposable began to watch their tone. No one explained it to Lena. No one needed to. She felt it the way you feel a door that used to stick suddenly open without resistance. You don't celebrate. You just wonder what changed behind the hinges. Roman rarely spoke to her directly. He didn't hover. He didn't assign her special treatment that would turn her into gossip. His presence remained quiet, controlled, almost invisible, except for the way the room reorganized itself around his rules. Lena noticed that too. At first, she told herself it was coincidence. Maybe the manager had finally tightened the floor. Maybe the staff had grown more alert after that first incident with the spilled milk. Maybe she was simply becoming more confident and people sensed it. But confidence didn't make men like that stop. Power did. And Roman Cole's power didn't announce itself. It simply made certain behaviours impossible. Outside the lounge, Lena's life remained narrow. She still returned to her father's house after each shift. She still moved quietly through a home that treated her as a temporary inconvenience. Her stepmother still measured her presence in small resentments, the water she used, the space she occupied, the hours she was gone, the hours she was not. Her father remained distant, his silence carrying the same message it always had. Do what you must, but do it without disturbing him. Lena didn't argue anymore. She didn't plead for understanding. She had already learned what silence meant in that house. So she worked. She picked up extra shifts, saved as much as she could, and kept her plans to herself. Her life became a series of practical steps. Earn, save, endure, repeat. It might have stayed that way for a long time if the past had not decided to return all at once. It began with her stepmother. One evening, Lena came home and found a folded paper waiting on the kitchen counter. Not hidden, not dramatic, just placed there like a reminder, a bill. Lena stared at the number, then at her stepmother's face. The woman didn't look angry. She looked inconvenienced, as if Lena had caused a mess simply by existing. It's overdue, her stepmother said. The house can't run on good intentions. Lena felt a familiar pull in her chest. The old pressure, the old responsibility that had never been hers, but had always been assigned to her anyway. She explained quietly that she was already contributing what she could, that she was saving to move out, that she wasn't in a position to take on more. Her stepmother's expression tightened just slightly, the way it always did when Lena tried to set a boundary. You have a job, she said. You have tips. You're not a child anymore, Lena. You can't just come back here and live for free. Lena swallowed the urge to defend herself. Defending herself never worked. It only gave people more places to poke. She nodded once. She took the bill. She went to her room and sat on the bed, staring at the paper until the numbers blurred. A part of her wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Her marriage had turned her into a provider for a man who lost money faster than she could earn it. Now her family wanted her to become a provider for a home that had never protected her. Lena felt her hands curl into fists, then loosen again. She wasn't surprised. What surprised her was how quickly her stepmother's demands increased. A bill became 2, then 3, then sudden expenses that appeared out of nowhere. Something broke, something needed repair, something had to be paid immediately. Each request came wrapped in the same tone, practical, reasonable, unavoidable. And each request carried the same implication. If you don't do this, you don't deserve to stay. Lena began to understand the quiet truth she had avoided naming. Her presence in that house was not a favour. It was a transaction. And transactions always came with a cost. She tried to hold her ground with calm consistency. She paid what she could. She refused what she couldn't. She avoided arguments. She kept working longer hours. But the pressure didn't ease. It tightened. Then Mark returned. Not in a dramatic way, not in a public scene. He didn't storm into the lounge or make a spectacle of himself. He waited. One night, after Lena's shift ended, she stepped outside into the cooler air and found him leaning against a car near the edge of the parking lot, as if he had every right to be there. Her first instinct was disbelief. The second was the familiar flash of fear. Mark looked slightly thinner than she remembered. His eyes were sharper. His movements had the restless energy of someone who hadn't slept well in a long time. He smiled as if they were old friends. Lena stopped walking. Mark spoke first, voice easy, almost amused. He said her name like it was his to use. Lena didn't answer. She didn't move closer. She didn't step back either. Her silence made his smile fade. He asked for money, not politely, as if the divorce had changed paperwork, but not entitlement. When Lena refused, Mark's voice hardened. He stepped forward, close enough that she could smell alcohol beneath whatever cologne he was trying to hide behind. He reminded her of things she didn't want to remember. He spoke as if her life still belonged to him. He used the same old tools: guilt, threat, mockery, whatever he thought might work. Lena's heartbeat grew louder, but her face remained still. She had learned that showing fear only invited more of it. Mark noticed her calm and misread it as arrogance. "You think you're safe now?" he said, voice low. "You think that place you work at can protect you?" Lena didn't respond. Mark's eyes shifted toward the building behind her. The lounge's lights glowed softly through the glass. Music pulsed faintly inside. Then Mark's mouth twisted into a grin that wasn't friendly. "So that's it," he said. "You found yourself a new protector." The word protector landed like an insult. Mark tilted his head, studying her, and his voice became smooth in the way it used to when he wanted to seem reasonable. "You really think a man like that notices you because he's kind?" he said. "A guy like Roman Cole doesn't do anything for free." Lena's stomach tightened. Mark leaned closer, lowering his voice further. His tone carried certainty, like someone sharing a truth Lena was too naive to understand. "He has options," Mark continued. "He could have anyone. People like him don't get involved unless they want something. So ask yourself, what does he want from you?" The question was meant to poison her, to take the one thing Lena had been slowly building, trust in her own judgment, and fracture it again. And it worked, at least for a moment. Not because Mark's logic was flawless, but because Lena's doubt had always been easy to wake. Her life had trained her to expect motives, to expect hidden costs, to expect that kindness came with a trap. Roman's quiet interventions, customers backing off, the lounge's rules protecting her, had felt real. But Mark's words made that reality shift slightly, as if someone had tilted a picture frame just enough to make it look wrong. Lena forced herself to breathe. Mark watched her carefully, sensing the opening he had created. Then he smiled again, softer this time, the way he used to when he wanted her to remember the version of him she once defended. "I'm just saying," he murmured, as if he cared. "Don't be stupid, Lena. Don't let someone else use you." The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't so cruel. Lena's voice came out quiet, controlled. She told him to leave. Mark's expression hardened. He stepped forward again, anger rising. But before he could do more than invade her space, the door behind Lena opened. A member of security stepped out, not running, not aggressive, simply present. The guard didn't look at Lena first. He looked at Mark. Mark's attention shifted, calculating. The guard spoke in a calm, professional tone. He asked Mark to move along. Mark scoffed, tried to laugh it off, tried to regain control of the situation the way men like him always did. He started to argue. The guard didn't argue back. He simply repeated the request with the same steady tone and stood his ground. Mark stared at Lena one last time. His eyes were sharp with resentment, but there was something else there too, uncertainty. He stepped away slowly, muttering a final insult as he walked back to his car. Then he drove off, leaving the parking lot quieter than before. Lena stood still, her hands trembling faintly, though she kept them close to her sides. The guard didn't ask questions. He didn't offer comfort. He simply waited until Mark was gone, then nodded once at Lena. "You're good?" he asked. Lena hesitated, then nodded. The guard returned inside without another word. Lena remained outside for several minutes, staring at the empty space Mark had occupied. She felt anger, but it was distant. What she felt more strongly was the aftertaste of Mark's words. A man like that doesn't do anything for free. It was the kind of sentence that could haunt a person if they let it. On the drive home, Lena replayed the conversation in her mind. Mark's certainty, his smugness, the way he'd said Roman's name like it was a weapon. When she entered her father's house, she found her stepmother waiting in the kitchen, as if she had been sitting there just to prove the home belonged to her. The woman looked up and immediately noticed Lena's tense expression. "You're late," she said. Lena didn't answer. Her stepmother's gaze sharpened. "You know we need to talk about the bills." Lena felt something inside her strain. Two pressures. Two hands pulling in opposite directions, both demanding she return to being manageable. That night, Lena lay awake and stared at the ceiling, hearing Mark's voice mingle with her stepmother's, the old pattern trying to rebuild itself. She had left one cage, only to find herself trapped between two others. In the following days, Mark didn't disappear. He called. He left messages. He appeared near her workplace again, not always close, enough to be seen by security, but close enough that Lena could feel watched. And her stepmother's demands continued, turning Lena's paycheck into a resource the house treated as its own. Lena began to feel the edges of panic she had thought she'd outgrown. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that lives in your lungs and makes every breath slightly shallow. At work, she moved through her shifts with the same professional calm she always kept. But her mind was distracted. Her body was tense. She caught herself scanning doors, watching shadows, listening too closely for footsteps. Roman did not speak to her about it, but he noticed. It happened in small ways at first. Security began to be stationed closer to the exit at the end of Lena's shifts. Not obvious, not dramatic, just a slight adjustment in routine. Mark's presence around the building became less frequent, as if the space itself had become inhospitable to him. Lena told herself not to read into it. Then one afternoon, she came in for a shift and found the manager waiting for her near the back hallway. He didn't look angry. He looked cautious. "There's someone who's been showing up," he said, keeping his voice low. "We've handled it. Just, if you see anything, tell security." Lena's stomach tightened. "We've handled it," the manager repeated, as if offering reassurance without explanation. Lena nodded. She didn't ask who made the call. She already knew, but Mark's words returned. "He doesn't do anything for free." Lena carried the sentence through her shift like a stone in her pocket. That evening, when she stepped outside, she half expected to see Mark again. She didn't. The parking lot was quiet. The air was cold enough to sting. The street beyond the lot hummed with distant traffic. Lena exhaled, the tension in her shoulders loosening slightly. Then she heard a familiar voice behind her. Mark. He was closer than before, emerging from the shadow between two cars, with the same casual confidence he always wore when he wanted to frighten her. His smile was strained, his eyes bright with anger. "You think you can disappear?" he said softly. "You think you can have someone else handle me?" Lena's pulse jumped. She forced herself not to back away. Mark stepped closer, voice dropping. "He's not going to save you forever," Before Lena could respond, Mark's gaze shifted to the side. Someone else was there. A man Lena had never seen before, well-dressed, calm, standing at a distance that suggested he wasn't security. He didn't carry himself like staff. He carried himself like someone who belonged. Mark stiffened. The swagger in his posture wavered. The stranger spoke quietly to Mark, not threatening, not aggressive, just certain. Lena couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the tone. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a warning. It was a boundary. Mark tried to laugh, tried to maintain control. He lifted his chin and said something back, likely attempting to insult or provoke. The stranger didn't react. He simply held Mark's gaze and waited. Something in Mark's expression shifted. The anger remained, but it was layered now with calculation. He glanced toward the lounge doors, toward the cameras, toward the silent presence of rules he couldn't override. Mark looked back at Lena one more time, eyes narrowed. Then he stepped away, muttering something bitter, and walked toward his car. He didn't drive off immediately. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, gripping it too tightly, as if arguing with his own pride. Then he left. The stranger remained. Lena watched him with guarded stillness. She didn't approach. She didn't ask questions. Something inside her insisted that questions were dangerous. The man looked at her once, briefly, and nodded in the direction of the building, toward safety, toward light. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Lena stood frozen for several seconds, her mind racing. She didn't know who the man was, but she knew who sent him. Roman. The realization didn't bring immediate comfort. It brought complexity, because now the past had spoken its poison aloud, and the present had answered with quiet force. Lena was caught in the middle, exactly where she didn't want to be. That night she sat alone in her room and stared at her phone, the screen dark. Mark had left messages. Her stepmother had left reminders. The demands were different, but the underlying message was the same. You belong to us. Lena pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw stars. She wasn't sure what she feared more, Mark's return, her family's grip, or the possibility that Mark might be right about Roman. Roman's help had been real. She couldn't deny that. But she had learned the hard way that help could become a leash if you weren't careful. Lena understood in that moment that being protected was not the same as being free, and freedom was what she wanted. In the days that followed, Lena watched Roman more closely, not to catch him in a lie, but to understand the shape of his attention. She noticed what he did not do. He didn't corner her for gratitude. He didn't ask personal questions. He didn't invite her into his world. He didn't offer help in ways that demanded repayment. He only reinforced the rules around her like someone sealing cracks in a wall, not to trap her inside, but to keep something out. Mark stopped appearing. The calls faded. The messages ended. It wasn't immediate, but it was unmistakable. As if the past had collided with a larger force and learned, reluctantly, to retreat. Lena didn't celebrate. She waited for the cost. And when the cost didn't come, a new kind of uncertainty took its place. She began to realize that what unsettled her most wasn't Roman's power. It was his restraint. Because Lena knew how to survive men who demanded, men who took, men who kept score. She didn't know how to respond to a man who drew a line, enforced it, and then walked away without asking for anything in return. The past had tried to pull her back into old roles. Roman's quiet interventions made that harder. But Mark's poison had done its work. It had planted doubt in the softest part of Lena's mind, the place that still believed she wasn't worth protection unless she paid for it. Lena wasn't ready to trust yet, but for the first time in her life, she considered a new possibility. Maybe safety didn't always come with a trap. Maybe some boundaries existed simply because someone believed they should. And if that was true, then the past was losing its grip. The quiet that followed surprised Lena more than the chaos ever had. After Mark disappeared from the edges of her life, after the calls stopped and the messages fell silent, Lena waited for something else to take its place. Another demand, another consequence, another reminder that peace was never free. But nothing came. Days passed, then weeks. The absence did not feel like victory. It felt like space, wide, unfamiliar, and slightly uncomfortable. Lena realized how accustomed she had been to tension, how used to measuring her days by what she needed to avoid. Without that constant pressure, time stretched differently. Mornings arrived without dread. Nights ended without fear. For the first time in years, her life did not revolve around someone else's volatility. Lena moved forward carefully, as if the ground beneath her might still give way. She focused on what she could control. She worked, she saved, she planned. Each choice, however small, felt deliberate. She found a modest place of her own, not perfect, not permanent, but hers. The first night she slept there, the silence felt almost too loud. There were no footsteps to track, no voices beyond the walls, no rules she hadn't agreed to. She lay awake for a long time, listening to nothing, learning how to exist without anticipation. It took time to trust that the quiet would last. At the lounge, Lena's presence changed in ways that were subtle but undeniable. She stood straighter. Her movements were less guarded. She still worked hard, still kept her professionalism intact, but something inside her had shifted. She no longer moved as if she might be taken away from herself at any moment. Roman noticed, though he never commented on it. He continued to keep his distance, his attention steady but restrained. He did not look for opportunities to insert himself into her life. He did not seek conversations that crossed lines Lena hadn't invited him to cross. Whatever role he had played in protecting her, from the past, he seemed content to let it end there. That restraint mattered. Lena understood power well enough now to recognize when it was being held back. Roman's presence remained constant, but never intrusive. He reinforced the boundaries of the space they shared, the lounge, the routines, the rules, and then stepped away, as if that were enough. And it was. They did not talk often. When they did, the exchanges were brief and practical, a nod in passing, a quiet acknowledgement, nothing that demanded interpretation. There were no questions about her past, no attempts to define what she owed or what she felt. Lena found herself thinking about him in moments of stillness, not with longing, but with curiosity. She wondered how someone with so much control could choose to exercise it so sparingly. She wondered what kind of life made a person value restraint more than possession. But she did not ask. Some things felt safer, left unnamed. The longer Lena lived in her own space, the more she understood how deeply her life had once been shaped by other people's decisions. Marriage had been chosen for her. Silence had been expected of her. Endurance had been mistaken for strength. Now strength felt different. It was quieter, more internal. It showed itself in choices no one else noticed, in saying no without explanation, in resting without guilt, in allowing herself to exist without justification. Lena began to solve the remaining problems in her life the same way, one at a time, on her own terms. She renegotiated what little contact she had with her family. She limited conversations that drained her. She stopped trying to prove she deserved space. Not everything healed at once. Some habits lingered. She still caught herself bracing for criticism that never came, still measured her worth by usefulness on her worst days. But now, when those thoughts surfaced, she recognized them as echoes rather than truths. Roman remained a quiet constant in the background of her life, not as a rescuer, not as a promise, but as something steadier, a presence that neither demanded nor withdrew, a reminder that safety did not always arrive with strings attached. There were moments, late nights at the lounge, early mornings when the city felt half asleep, when Lena sensed something unspoken between them, not tension, not expectation, recognition. They understood each other in a way that didn't require explanation. They shared an awareness of boundaries, of what it meant to survive without becoming hard. That understanding did not ask to be labelled, and so it wasn't. Lena did not call what existed between them love. She did not call it friendship either. Those words felt too small, too definitive. What mattered was not what it was, but how it felt. It felt safe. It felt chosen. It felt like standing beside someone without being pulled forward or pushed back. For the first time in her life, Lena did not need to disappear to stay. She lived quietly now, but not invisibly. She made decisions without rehearsing them for approval. She trusted her own judgment enough to let it guide her forward, even when the path ahead remained uncertain. The past no longer chased her. It lingered at a distance, unable to close the gap. One evening, as Lena locked up her apartment and stepped into the calm of her new routine, she paused and let herself take it in. The ordinary peace of it all. The fact that nothing was demanding her attention, her apology, her sacrifice. She smiled, just slightly. This life did not come with guarantees. It did not promise permanence or romance or grand transformation, but it belonged to her. And after everything she had endured, that was enough. Lena walked forward without naming what lay beside her, without defining what might come next. She did not need to. For the first time, she was not living a life that had been decided for her. She was living one she had chosen. And that choice, quiet, steady, and entirely her own, was more than she had ever been allowed before. It was enough.